Now, each of the projects that we're specifically addressing today are new construction, but one of the thorniest issues right now is, do we build new or do we walk away? And walk away, or do we renovate what we have? Any thoughts on that tough series of issues?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's a tough question, but I think it comes down to what the value is of the thing that you're renovating. Obviously, buildings that are being built right now, if I think of homes along the outer belt perimeter that are thrown together very quickly and cheaply and may not even have a lifespan on their own of 30 plus years, and I think of some of our older building stock, which has been around 100 plus years, I think the value proposition of saving one versus another is not completely, equal. Obviously, when you're dealing with existing structures that have been built solidly, there obviously is much more of a reason to save and or add on to in an adaptive reuse way. I think the flexibility of a building over time, I think there's some things that architects need to think about, is the change in the life of the building generally is inevitable. Warehouses today are now lofts, the warehouses of the past are now the lofts of today. And somehow those structures were flexible enough to allow for that type of adaptation. And so as we look forward to a sustainable approach in terms of how we plan our buildings, I think that type of thinking toward future adaptation is critical in terms of systems and structures and that type of thing.
Yeah, oddly enough, when we started Dell, for having such a futuristic approach, we actually looked to the past. We happened to do some research on all of the mission architecture that is in that part of Texas. The Alamo is a mission. You always think of it in the battle in Texas and all that as some kind of fort or something. It's not. It's a mission. And missions kind of led us to look at monasteries and cloisters. And so we punctuated our building with a series of courtyards to admit daylight, put as much circulation around them as we could, and use that for wayfinding orientation purposes. So again, we look back as much as forward, and you think a lot of old buildings that don't have the mega footprints that so many of our modern structures do from the mid-20th century on, where essentially electric lighting overwhelmed all the needs for any daylighting to even occur. And so you look at a lot of those buildings and they're very compatible because they have footprints that can actually admit daylight. Now, again, even if you just go down to the bare shell and frame of the building, you still are probably saving on the order of 20-25% of the cost as long as that frame is usable. So there's no reason to not recycle the building, even if you have to go down so far as just the raw structural frame. Now, granted, there are just simply some things where even if the building's structurally compatible, it may simply not have the kind of footprint to accommodate certain modern things. But I would even argue on a hospital, most of my career, we did very large mega footprints that sprawled on forever. And at Dell, it was quite a challenge for us to do medical space planning in a building that was essentially a series of 64-foot wide spaces because we punctuated all of these 64-foot square courtyards. So our goal was to try to never be more than 32 feet from an outside wall and borrow that light through clear stories and other means. It was not the same old in terms of laying out medical spaces where you just kind of went on infinitely and it didn't really matter. So again, it's still, I think there's a lot to be said for recycling old buildings. Again, and I agree about the houses and some of the things we're seeing now that simply aren't going to be around in 50 years.
They're almost better as scrap at this point, I think.
Well, they're actually in the wrong place.
Exactly, yeah. I mean,
$4 so a gallon gas next couple of weeks, it gets harder and harder to commute from those distant places. Let the animals have those places, not humans.
Well, it was interesting. What you said earlier tied well with what you just said now, which was the design innovation. Like the approach that you were just talking about with regard to Dell, creation of the courtyards, the distance and the distance to the outside wall, and the natural lighting. I mean, those were all driven by constraint. All those innovations are driven by constraint, and I think that's what designing a sustainable building offers to you. It's like, here are your constraints. How are you going to make meaning out of all these constraints? And I think that's it's an exemplary sort of.
Well, that's what always produces great architecture. If you had the most willing client and an infinite budget and everything was perfect, I'm not sure what I would do. I wouldn't even know. First of all, I wouldn't know how because I've never had that happen. But nonetheless, all the good stuff comes out of all those constraints and all those
Absolutely.
little conflicts and struggling to make something happen that navigates all those treacherous waters is what makes great architecture. And those constraints can be turned into the liabilities become assets.
I'm curious, 20 years from now, when we're looking at this video and reflecting on where life has taken us and where the industry has gone over that two-decade period, where do we think that energy and environmental awareness will have taken us over that two-decade period? What will have changed?
Ask my children, I guess.
I don't know. I really hope that we do heed the call. Again, I always say that I know there's a lot of people who are still even in denial about global warming and other things, and I'm like, wave to somebody who's fallen off a building halfway down and, hey, I'm doing fine. It's that last 6 inches that gets you. So, and if you've read Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, you'll see that in the history of mankind, there have been a lot of civilizations that simply have ignored what's going on. I mean, who cut down the Easter Island where they built all the monoliths? They were still in the middle of carving more monoliths when they cut the last tree down and completely wiped themselves out. So I hope we heed all of those signals from the past and that we really do have, I think the green movement in architecture has proven itself. It will become a necessity. And it's very funny. I had the great opportunity to spend my junior year of college in Rome. And when you look at per capita energy consumption, I always viewed Italy as kind of an ideal place to live. And boy, I wish someday I could retire in Italy. They use about half the energy per capita that an American does. And yet I view their lifestyle as a wonderful lifestyle. So I think too many people think that we're going to have to give up all these things. And there's also another book called Bowling Alone where they talk about how we've sort of isolated ourselves out and deeper out into suburbia, and we no longer, when I was a kid, you didn't have to worry about anything happening to your kids because in the community I grew up in was a very dense older community and everybody was sitting on their front porches and there were literally hundreds of surrogate parents. Nobody was going to do anything to you, nor were you going to do anything because somebody knew you and knew your parents and you were going to get a report home later on about that.
Yeah, Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities and things of that nature.
Right, and so I view all of these things that we're going to come back around and understand that all these things that we hold so near and dear and cherish and being isolated in our giant SUVs as we drive out into deep suburbia to sit in our back porches with giant fences around each other, isolated from one another, not knowing each other. I think all of these things you're going to see the win-win, just like the benefits of daylighting or whatever else that is inside a building. I believe all these things, the logic of all this stuff and the rightness of it will, human beings naturally know what's right. And I do believe, while there's a lot of very depressing things about the history of humanity, I do believe it's been a forward march. And I do believe we'll see the benefits of this.